Good morning, everyone. I think we've got some people coming in, so I'll wait for another minute or so. But thank you all for joining this morning. Hopefully, this is going to be an interesting and informative session. I'm sure lots of you are familiar, at least with the name, Awaab's Law. And today is just going to be an introduction into what you need to know when you need to know it. So we hope to have subsequent sessions to run through things in a little more detail, but this is just to give you the broad overview of the law itself. So I'll just wait for a few more seconds and then I'll dive straight into it. Thank you for those who are on time. Alrighty, I'll get started. And I'll get started with some housekeeping to begin with. That's always nice as people are coming in. So all mics and cameras will be turned off during this session. However, there is a chat function. So feel free, please, to add your thoughts, comments, any questions you might have. And also, honestly, feel free to discuss things amongst yourself in that chat as well. There'll also be a couple of poll questions that come up on screen throughout that you can engage with, and please do. However, I have been made aware that because you are mostly local authority, there are sometimes some issues with government IT channels. That means that you can't respond to the polls themselves. However, as I said, there is a chat function, so you can always just drop your result in or your answer in there instead. This meeting, as you can probably see, is being recorded, so we'll be able to share the recording with you afterwards. There is also a Q&A tab at the top of the webinar, so you can ask specific questions in there, and then you can upvote them, so put a little thumbs up next to them. So do that for the ones that you're the most interested in, because if there are lots, I might not be able to get through to all of them, but I'll do the most important ones. And we've had some questions sent in before the webinar. So the wonderful Mackenzie, who is sitting behind the scenes, will put them in there so we can catch up on those. So I think we've got most people in. Welcome, everyone. As I said, this is going to be an introduction to Awaab's Law today. My name is Francesca Brady, if you're looking for me on LinkedIn, but otherwise you can call me Frankie. I am the in-house indoor environmental quality expert at Bellrock. I'm also an expert advisory member for an organisation called London Clean Air, for the BREEAM Health and Wellbeing Technical Group. There is a national occupational standard for IAQ coming out, which I've contributed to. And I was also a member of the International Well Building Institute's COVID-19 task force, which is such a mouthful back in the day. But I think the most important and relevant piece of work that I've done to date is I worked with Impact on Urban Health for a social housing project in Lambeth and Southwark, where we utilised Internet of Things technologies to look at things like temperature, humidity, and other indoor pollutants in the home. So I am delighted to have you with me this morning. We're going to discuss Awaab's Law, which comes into effect from October this year, so October 2025. And we're going to discuss what it means for local authorities and social housing providers. And I understand that legislative change can be perhaps quite overwhelming. So today's session is just about breaking things down, making them super clear, making sure you understand what you can action off the back of today's session. And by the end of this webinar, you'll hopefully have a solid understanding of what Awaab's Law is and why it's been created, when it's coming into effect and what you need to know, the key points of the legislation, and what you need to do to stay compliant. So the session will last for around 30 minutes, and then I'm hoping we'll have a decent chunk of time at the end to go through any Q&A. So let's get started. So, I think there's some more people coming in. So yes, what is Awaab's Law and why has it been introduced? So to understand why this law exists, we need to cast our minds back to 2020 and the tragic death of Awaab Ishaq. So Awaab was a 2-year-old boy who died due to chronic prolonged exposure to black mold in his family's social housing home in Rochdale. Despite his parents raising concerns multiple times to their landlord, Rochdale Borough-wide Housing, the issues were not resolved. So Awaab developed a respiratory illness, which is listed in his cause of death on his death certificate, that ultimately led to his death. And in 2022, a coroner at Rochdale Coroner's Court ruled that his death was caused by this prolonged exposure to black mold in his home, which had been caused by, and I've written the exact quote on screen, inadequate ventilation that was not equipped for normal day-to-day living activities, which led to excess damp and condensation. Because sometimes when we're talking about damp and mold in homes, there is an inclination to talk more about the use of the home, so the lifestyle, the way that people utilize their spaces, drying clothes indoors, not opening windows properly. However, there are two sides to this responsibility. Yes, how people use their homes, but also the design of the homes themselves and the communication of how to best use the space back to the tenant. So in this particular very tragic case, it exposed a serious failure in the social housing system, where complaints about damp and mold were ignored or delayed, leaving a vulnerable tenant in unsafe living conditions. There has since been public outcry following Awaab's death that's led to a commitment from the government to introduce tougher legislation, hence Awaab's law, ensuring that social housing landlords act swiftly to address health hazards, and the law is designed to protect tenants and residents, ensuring that what happened to Awaab never happens again to anyone else. And that brings us to Awaab's law. So I think we may have a poll. So I want to understand how many of you feel like you have an understanding of the key points of the legislation coming in this year. Hopefully most of you will be able to answer the poll on screen. Again, if not, just feel free to put your response in the chat box. Okay, so whilst you're doing that, I'll move on to the next slide. So when is Awaab's law coming into effect? And this is the sort of thing that obviously the headline that everyone might have seen will be October 2025, but what does it actually mean? And there is a phased implementation, but damp and mold is the one that you need to focus on for October 2025. So the focus in October 2025, as I said, will be mold. So it's investigating and rectifying dangerous damp and mold issues. In 2026, there's going to be an expansion beyond damp and mold to additional hazards like extreme temperatures, structural issues, fire risks, and hygiene concerns. So things outside the scope of this webinar. I'm just going to be talking about what's coming in October 2025, but I thought it'd be useful just to touch on future phases as well. And then in 2027, that's going to bring about the inclusion of all remaining hazards defined by the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, excluding overcrowding. So the key milestones, what do you need to know? So here are the main provisions in Awaab's law, so the things that you really need to know by October 2025. So there are going to be mandatory response times. So landlords will be required to investigate and remediate health hazards like damp and mold in strict timeframes. These timeframes will be set by secondary legislation, but are expected to be around the initial investigation about a complaint being conducted within 14 days, so within a fortnight, the written findings of that investigation being provided 48 hours post-investigation, and then the commencement of any work that's required needs to happen within 7 days after those findings. And it needs to be completed promptly. So that's still nice and vague, but ASAP is the general message. And then in exceptional cases, and this is the reason I've put 24 hours there, in exceptional cases where the hazards like damp and mold have posed significant and immediate risk to tenants, for example, severe damp affecting respiration, these must be addressed within 24 hours or it will necessitate tenant relocation. And that felt like a really important one to put in there. Second to that, accountability measures. So landlords must keep clear records of complaints and actions taken. because failure to comply is not good news. It can lead to fines, legal action. So landlords who fail to comply can be taken to court by their tenants, and public reputational damage. The third thing is, and it doesn't necessarily say this in the law itself, but it is encouraged. It is encouraged to be proactive rather than reactive. So rather than waiting for complaints, I think this kind of does what it says on the tin, but rather than waiting for those complaints, landlords must aim to try and identify and address issues before they become serious health hazards. It is also the most cost-effective way to do things. So this is where, in a number of thought leadership pieces and blogs that I've read about Awaab's law, there's been mention of data loggers. So these kind of sensors that you can put in specific areas of a home, maybe in high-risk homes where you've seen a lot of historic damp and mold issues. You can put sensors in that monitor temperature, humidity, maybe even CO2 to understand the ventilation in the space. And that can be really helpful for being proactive. The fourth thing is stronger enforcement powers. So the Housing Ombudsman and Regulator of Social Housing will have increased power to hold non-compliant landlords accountable. The extension of the decent home standard. So social housing properties must meet stricter quality requirements to ensure all homes are fit for habitation. Again, in this particular case, I'm talking about damp and mold, but it does extend beyond that. And then finally, public reporting and transparency. So landlords must demonstrate compliance with these health and safety requirements, and tenants will have greater rights, as I've said before, to challenge poor living conditions. And then the final bit that I wanted to mention on this slide that isn't necessarily relevant to social housing, but it is something that is coming, is when it was announced about a month ago that Awaab's law would come into effect in October this year, it was also announced by the housing minister that further reforms were coming and they were going to be introduced, which are designed to drive up standards across social housing, but also that the government will introduce powers through the Renters' Rights Bill to extend Awaab's law into the private rented sector, which I think has probably set alarm bells going, but one thing at a time. So you'll see the second poll question that's just come up on your slides. So, and this might be quite a difficult one, and perhaps there are more than one response that you want to tick here. But which of these areas do you feel like will be the hardest to ensure compliance? Just give you a couple of seconds to respond to that. And then I'll look back at the poll results towards the end of this session, and I'll see if there are any kind of key takeaways from this, and we can speak to those. So how do you stay compliant? This is a big one. So what should you be doing right now? Well, what you can do right now before October this year is put a plan of action in place. So we have outlined 5 simple steps to ensure a almost foolproof compliance plan. So review existing housing stock, which, depending on the volume of housing stock you have, might be a massive task. But to review this housing stock and identify high-risk properties in particular, where damp and mold is an issue, and then you can prioritise those inspections. And then there is also this element that by law, landlords must schedule annual inspections of properties that have had historic cases of damp and mold. So I think in that case, it does make the task slightly more manageable to say, okay, in our records, which ones have historically been problematic? And actually, that's where you can focus most of this attention. As I said before, October 2025 is going to be investigate and rectify dangerous damp and mold issues. Those are the ones really that you need to start with. And then the second in the 5-step plan is implement a fast response system. So like I said, there are very strict timelines. They are 14 days, 7 days, 48 hours, 24 hours. It's it's quite a lot. So having a structured system with a level of prioritization against tickets that are raised around complaints is going to be essential for management. So ensuring all complaints about hazards are logged and then addressed within these legal timeframes. The third step, improve or optimize maintenance and prevention strategies. So regular maintenance checks and early intervention will prevent these legal risks and costly emergency repairs. When I undertook the project with the social housing in London, there were a number of instances where we saw completely blocked extractor fans, or in some cases, we saw extractor fans that were blocked by tenants. And this is where tenants and landlords really need to work together. So the physical inspection of these high-risk sites will probably flag concerns about blockages that tenants have caused in front of extractor fans. But then it is important, because you don't know what you don't know as a tenant, to be told about these things and how the tenants themselves can improve their living environments as well. Number 4 in the 5-step compliance plan is training staff and contractors. That kind of goes without saying. So ensure all relevant teams understand the urgency of what they're being asked to do, and all the key issues, and making sure things are documented clearly. Perhaps you want pictures alongside notes, that sort of thing, because there are these legal implications. And then number 5, keep records and stay transparent. So document all inspections, all complaints, all repairs, follow-ups to prove compliance. For example, a damp and mold safety certificate must be given to the tenant to confirm an inspection of the property has been undertaken and there are no risks from hazards. And it's important to state that providers of social housing must report to the regulator of social housing on all damp and mold cases that aren't resolved for whatever reason. And then again, the final one that isn't number 6 on the 5-step compliance plan, but it is important to note, is this education to tenants. As I said before, you don't know what you don't know as a user of the space. So if a tenant has trickle ventilation, they need to know why it exists, when they should be using it. They need to know that in an ideal world, if they're going to dry their clothes indoors because perhaps they don't have a tumble dryer or it's too cold to dry clothes outside, best practice would encourage the use of a dehumidifier. So little things, not massive lifestyle behavioral changes, but using extractor fans, as long as they're properly maintained, using dehumidifiers, particularly where you've got a strong source of moisture. So this is our 5-step compliance plan. Failure to act not only risks legal consequences, but potentially significant reputational damage. If landlords fail to adhere to the regulated timeframes when addressing any issues about damp and mold, I mentioned in my previous slide there could be fines, and it's been touted these could be around the £30,000 mark, or you could be banned from renting properties out. And tenants can claim compensation if they've been suffering from damp and mold within their property, specifically those who have been exposed to prolonged damp and mold issues. So in summary, and I've still got a little bit to say after this, but in summary for Awaab's law marks a critical shift in housing regulation aimed at protecting lives. It's not just about compliance, albeit I feel like I said that word about 100 times in this webinar. It is about responsibility. So it's acting quickly on complaints is no longer optional. Proactivity is key. And failure to comply leads to a whole host of issues. So let's get that compliance plan in place. Stephen, yes, you can have the slides for later. The session's been recorded, so we'll send you the slides themselves and we'll send you the recording of this session. So as I said, that's kind of wrapped up Awaab's law. I thought it was important to put a slide in about beyond Awaab's law, so beyond social housing, because I have mentioned that there will be this extension into private sector housing, which is important to note. But also, I sort of wanted to talk about schools, schools and other local authority buildings, because social housing won't be what is in your stock entirely. So schools aren't explicitly covered under Awaab's law, but there is, or there should be, this kind of sense of duty of care over staff and students, which aligns to the same principles as Awaab's law. So in the meantime, there is documentation under Part F, building regulations, that can be used to understand minimum requirements or newer minimum requirements, because it was updated not long ago, such as mandatory carbon dioxide monitoring in all new non-domestic dwellings. So really, if we're kind of looking at the general theme of Awaab's law and how this could be extended into guidance for schools and local authority buildings, you should ensure all buildings are well maintained, and in particular well ventilated. That seems to be historically a major issue. Create some sort of reporting system. So in schools for staff, students, parents to flag hazards. The undertaking of regular indoor environmental quality audits isn't necessarily commonplace, but it is very good practice, because a lot of the time, if it's not necessarily a damp and mold issue in schools or in other local authority buildings, there might be issues with the indoor environmental quality, indoor air quality that you can't see because you can't see air, which is very frustrating. And this is where data loggers kind of come into their own. So the CO2 monitoring that was happening in classrooms, particularly as a result of COVID, was making that invisible element of the quality of the space visible. And then finally, kind of maintaining compliance records to demonstrate this proactive approach. So I think whilst we're saying, okay, there was a tragic death that's led to this new piece of legislation coming in for social housing, it will be pushed into private rental sector. And I don't think it's too much of a push to say that it will become something that's encompassed in the wider property piece, so the built environment as a whole. And on that note of monitoring, I would be so interested to know whether anyone on this call today has seen, trialed, has existing systems that monitor indoor air quality. So it might just be temperature and humidity. It might be CO2 as well. It might be something beyond even that. I've come across a lot of it. So my background academically is indoor environmental quality. And then in my career, I've used a lot of Internet of Things devices, a lot of data, and had to produce a lot of and what now. So I'm really interested in that question in particular. So yeah, and then final thoughts. To wrap up, I hope this session has provided you with clear insight into Awaab's law, why it's here, what you need to know, and steps on how to comply with the law itself. And then one more question, because obviously we're here today to introduce you to Awaab's law, but also to help if you need help. So it'd be really, really good to know how many of you know what you need to do and have the access to the relevant support, how many could do with some gaps being filled, and then who just needs support generally before October 2025. So I'll give you a few moments there. And we've got some questions. We've got some good results for the polls as well. Yeah, okay, so it looks like the majority of you have some idea of what's coming with Awaab's law, but a few gaps in knowledge. And I'm really hoping today has helped with that. What we will do after this session is share the recording, share the slides. There are a lot of good resources out there. For example, the BESA, so Building Engineering Services Association. I've done quite a lot of work with them, and they've got some really good free guides on damp and mold. What I would like to do as a follow-up session to this, because this has just been the introduction, is to know whether you would all like to see a session on the practical implementation. So practically, what do we need to do and what are some good examples to lean on? So I think we have perhaps some people on the call who have had experience in maybe some elements of this, whether it's been compliance documentation and records or this kind of data logger approach. That is an overwhelming yes to the next session. That's good to know. Because whilst I was creating this presentation and the content that I wanted to show you guys today, I did come across a few councils who have explored in trials the use of sensors that monitor temperature and humidity at a minimum and CO2 in most cases, and then use those metrics and a very basic calculation on the back end to produce a risk indicator. So they might choose like the 10% of housing stock that has the most issues, roll out sensors into those houses in key areas. It's not like you need to flood these houses with sensors in every single room. Perhaps it's the kitchen and the bedroom that have had issues in the past of mold. So you put data loggers in those rooms, and then you would have alerts and notifications that come through to say, okay, there is a pattern in damp and humidity, which leads us to believe that this house is probably experiencing condensation, which would lead to damp and mold. So I think it would be really insightful to kind of bring a few real world cases into the room and talk through those, and also talk through why perhaps they haven't progressed to a full rollout. And it could just be the case that it's an issue with cost, and actually how as we can, as an industry, tackle that and drive things down as much as possible now that we know it's obviously legislation as well. Practical example would be very handy, no problem. Under HHSRS mold in a home occupied by children 16 higher risk than adults, please confirm. So that's a good question, Graham. I can't confirm 100%, but I would say that generally there are vulnerable groups. So that would include children under the age of 16. It would include adults over the age of about 75, 80, and anyone with underlying health issues. So I will confirm that for you and come back to you, but that would be something that I can't say with 100% certainty in terms of answering that question. But it is definitely something that needs to be prioritized, are those vulnerable groups, and for sure under 16s being one of them. It would be useful to know in more detail what enforcement looks like with private landlords. Okay, so I think it's going to look identical. It might be the case that the challenges are greater in terms of the introduction of things like sensors. I think with the private rented sector, it's going to be a case of understanding where the responsibility lies between the landlord and the tenant. So the same in social housing, albeit there is a lot of responsibility being put on landlords, which is why sessions like this are so important, because it is not nice to know that you're being shouldered with such responsibility come October, particularly when the repercussions are as serious as they potentially could be. So I'd say with the private rented sector, it will be very, very similar. It'll just be perhaps slightly more different in terms of the dynamic between landlord and tenant. Sophie, if the social housing provider is keeping compliant, but the tenants aren't helping the situation despite being educated, what can we do then? That is something that will be one of these, I think, probably most challenging aspects. And it will probably take the first, I'd say 18 to 24 months of this coming into effect to understand what that looks like. What I would suggest is, if you're keeping these super clear records where you've got pictures of what's happening, you've got a record of the fact that the occupier has been equipped with perhaps a one-pager to say, here are the key things that you need to do to ensure that you're living in the healthiest space possible. if you go in and you see that an extract is blocked consistently every single visit, then I think you can say without a shadow of the doubt, there's no more that you could do as a provider of the housing. It is down to the tenant at that point. I appreciate that's more difficult to do when, even if you go for an inspection, you can't tell whether someone is using the extractor fan when they should be. So when they're bathing, when they're cooking, and you can't tell whether someone is drying clothes indoors. I think that's where the data loggers really come into their own to say, okay, well, in a similar property, we have data loggers, and perhaps you do have an example where the tenant is using the space well. And it's like, well, this would suggest that this is the quality of the environment that we are delivering when it's being used properly. And then in this case, we can say with some degree of confidence that it is an impact of lifestyle and a lack of changes to lifestyle that are causing these issues. But, and this is where it is, and I've been on a number of webinars in the last couple of weeks about this, is we can't, there's very little you can do in terms of stopping people, for example, drying their clothes indoors if they don't have the equipment to dry their clothes otherwise. So I think in that situation, it would be, and I don't know how this would work, honestly, and this is where I wish you guys could interact with me verbally. But if there was a way that you could subsidize the procurement of dehumidifiers and roll them out, because it is such an easy win with a dehumidifier. It doesn't, you're not required to open windows if you can run the dehumidifier all day long. Yes, it helps in terms of other indoor pollutants, but it is such a good remedy for excess moisture in the air. So yeah, that's a really good question. And I think as long as you're doing everything you can, you're documenting it really clearly, you have the best case should any issues reach the legal courts. I think you'd be in the best position you could be to say, we've done everything that we can. We are fully compliant. We have black and white evidence of what we've done and why we think that we are fully protected. So that's all I can recommend now. I think it's going to be just a matter of time and just seeing how things play out beyond that. Protrimeter have some good handheld devices identify condensation risk. Yeah, Stephen, I think that's a good one. And if this is where I think as a community on this call, it would be really helpful for me to maybe identify a couple of you to bring into the next session to say, what did you do? If you can talk about the products you used, what did you use? Because for others, then they don't have to go through the whole rigmarole of trying to find the right product, finding out that actually maybe it's not the ideal one, and what successful implementation looks like. And I think that would be really valuable because I have some knowledge, but I'm not in local authority. So I have kind of limitations in terms of how you can roll these things out successfully in the social housing sector. My background's more like I know what sensors are good and I know what you can do with the data afterwards. So for example, as Bellrock, we can generate this kind of risk identifier based on certain data that's coming through. But I think a practical session as a follow-up to this would be ideal with some people on the call with me who can talk about the successes and maybe some of the failures that they've had with these systems, what works well and what doesn't, just to save everyone some time. I mean, October sounds like it's far away, but it's not. You referenced a damp and mold safety certificate being issued after inspection. Can you elaborate on this? Is there a specific form or is this equivalent to the written? So it is a specific form. I can share this. So like I said before, we'll share a recording of this session. We'll share some collateral, so like freebie resources from here, there, and everywhere that you can just dig into for a bit more. And we'll share any templates that currently exist. Again, I'm sure there are more that are going to come to light in the next 6 months or so. But yeah, we'll share everything that we can with you. So in terms of that 5-step compliance plan, you almost have something for everything. And then we'll touch on data loggers in the next session. Peter, will the guidance for Awaab's law come out with the legislation? So it kind of has. So yes, it will. But as with most things, it's the kind of clickbait, Awaab's law is coming, what do you need to do? You have to then go and dig around for the information. So what I'm hoping is we have consolidated most of the guidance in a very concise way throughout these slides. What we'll aim to do in following sessions is say, okay, now this bit has come to light, and actually it's slightly clearer what you need to do around the compilation of documentation. And like, this is the sort of system it needs to be collected in, and it needs to maybe be standardized in some sort of way. So yeah, in terms of the guidance, that's why we're here, to try and piece all of this together for you, so you don't need to go around and see conflicting views on things. We'll consolidate everything, and hopefully we'll give you a folder with basically the Bible to guidance for the legislation. Can the social landlord issue a Section 239 for right of access after multiple no access visits? Very good question. Again, I don't know what the answer is to this question because I'm not from a social housing background, but I would imagine if things are bad enough, then there should be measures in place where you are able to access the property after a certain number of no visits. I mean, it could be that, the property says it's being used, but actually there's no one there. And I don't know what happens under those circumstances and whether you are able to gain access to that property. But I would imagine, because, and this is where it comes to the compliance, you can't be compliant if you're not allowed to access the property. So I think there should definitely be something around that, and I'll make a note of all these questions that I need to come back to you guys on. So it's the confirmation of the vulnerable groups, and then it's the what do you do if you can't access the property multiple times. I'll come back to you on those two questions. Demi, are all cases to be viewed the same? For example, we may have a severe damp and mold case which could affect health, in which case the time frames are clear. Should we use the same guidance on timeframes for someone who has minor condensation around the window? It still requires inspection, but wouldn't this class as urgent? So yeah, if someone's got minor condensation around the window, that wouldn't be flagged as urgent. The most urgent ones, and the ones where the 24-hour rule comes into place, are where there is very bad, very visible mold. I don't know if any of you watched the Panorama episode a couple of weeks ago. In those cases, the mold was so prolific that level of mold would be creating respiratory issues. So either it would be that, I don't know, a GP has issued a medical note to say that this person's suffering respiratory issues, that would be flagged as urgent. Or if there was a complaint about mold and then upon inspection there was very, very bad black mold, for example, then that would warrant the 24-hour rule. It is difficult to know because you might have someone who has respiratory issues triggered by allergens in the home. It might not actually be mold. So again, there's going to be kind of a bit of trial and error in this first place. But yeah, I would say it's probably going to be quite obvious which ones are the urgent 24-hour ones, because I imagine in the past they have been consistently flagged as being problematic. So I hope that answers your question. But yes, if it's just some condensation around the window, wouldn't be an issue. It's only when that condensation then turns into damp and mold issues that those inspections kick in. And then if it gets really, really bad, it's a 24-hour rule. What about the running costs of dehumidifiers? So I think a really good example of the use of these types of practical solutions is knowing when to use them. So for example, I live in a Victorian property and it is very prone to damp and mold. But I know how to use my space in order to mitigate those issues as much as I can. So with my dehumidifier, I run it overnight, and I run it if I'm showering during the day or if I'm cooking. I wheel it into the kitchen with me. So I basically put it as close to the source as possible when that source is active. And then I run it overnight because the cost of running it overnight is much lower. I appreciate that even any little increase is going to be quite hard for some people to stomach. But again, this is where if the burden of the cost can be carried in any way between the two parties, between tenant and landlord, I think that's really important to explore. Because obviously, if you're going to face fines for not complying, then there's a case to say, okay, well, we need to allocate a certain amount of budget to avoid reputational damage, fines, legal action. And I appreciate the fines aren't astronomical, so you kind of need to balance the two things out. But I would say that, again, it's in properties that are high risk, or if you've got vulnerable groups, or you've got cases of fuel poverty. Those are kind of the three main groups that need to be prioritized in terms of any financial support. Oh, someone else has used those sensors. That's good to know. Right, okay, I'll do this last one, and then I think we'll wrap up this session. Right of access. Oh, I think someone's actually just responded. Perfect, you guys. Someone's responded to that S239 notice. So what I'll do as a follow-up to this is we'll issue the recording, we'll issue the collateral. I will find the answers to those questions that I wasn't able to answer with 100% certainty. We'll send all of that out to you, and then we will try and reconvene perhaps in a couple of weeks with some people on the call with me, and we can discuss these real world solutions, systems that have been successful, again, discussing the successes and the failures of them. And we'll aim to get everyone in the perfect place come October 2025. And there will be teething problems, there will be difficulties, but I think our priority is to work with you and make sure you have a pretty watertight solution in place going into October 2025, knowing there were always going to be stumbling blocks at the beginning of things like this. But yeah, this has been a brilliant session, and thank you all so much for attending. We'll send everything out shortly. Good, thank you, Sophie. I'm glad it's been helpful. And next time it'll be really nice because you guys will get to listen to other voices that aren't just mine. But yeah, thank you so much for coming today, and have a brilliant day. Thank you.